All right, class, so we're going to do our quick review now. And the first thing we're going to look at, because we are looking at the Gilded Age, or the era in which it was covered with a veneer of gold, meaning that there was such great wealth, but under the surface, not so much. We're just going to look at some of the things that had changed in the United States during this time period. So one, immigration changes. And immigration, of course, the immigrants are going to come through two places, Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in California. The groups of immigrants had changed from what they had been during the period of time the United States had been going through since the beginning, from Western Europe to now they're coming in from Eastern Europe, from Asia, from areas in Latin America. So we have a huge change around 1890 is about what type of immigrants are coming through. Now, Ellis Island and Angel Island both have an incredibly difficult processing system that, of course, is going to lead to all sorts of culture shock as people are coming from their former countries into the United States and suddenly being thrown into a system of medical checks and into crowded lines. And as you can see through any of the images of Angel Island or Ellis Island during this time period, just packing people in, bringing them into the country as quickly as possible. So as people are coming into the U.S. for this new life, there is quite a bit of pushback from many of the people in the United States, and this is known as nativism. Nativism is that belief that those people who were here beforehand are the better group of people, and those who are coming in are some type of drain on society, taking their jobs or something along those lines. And one of the greatest examples of how things change in the United States is these nativist attitudes lead to acts such as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act is where the Chinese settlers who have been coming into the United States are now going to be blocked by federal law from coming into the United States. They've been welcomed during the construction of the railroad, but once that's finished, these people are cast aside and given very greatly mistreated. So during this time period, there's a great amount of urban growth or urbanization, and urbanization is that move into the cities. That's part of why immigrants are able to move into the United States. The American dream is the urbanization is going to allow for a greater number of jobs, decline in farming. About 1 in 12 people in 1840 live in the city, but by 1900, it's 1 in 3 people. So this new technology factors fewer workers in the farms, bring people into the cities because of industrialization in order to give all sorts of opportunities to those people who are in the industries. So a lot of urban problems as people move in, and that's one of the things we've been looking at as we looked at Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives in class, is the fact that there are these very poor housing conditions. And very poor housing for immigrants and people who work in the cities would be known as a tenement. And a tenement, we've already seen, we've looked at, that's that breaking down of that one building into many, many different apartments as small as possible and many people living in them, sometimes up to 12 families, in order to make as much money as possible as the building supervisor or owner, and to give these people some place to live. With many people, increased crime rates, very few city services. We know that in the 1870s, 1800s, cities had been built out of wood. Chicago burns down in 1871. Great amounts of pollution and diseases that we've talked about. We mentioned Jacob Riis. He is a muckraker. And a muckraker, as we said in class, is a journalist who is exposing some of the negative things in society. Jacob Riis wrote How the Other Half Lives, but there's also people like coming up into the next unit, Upton Sinclair, Lincoln Stebbins, etc. But he's trying to push for awareness being made to help out immigrants in the United States. And this movement is social gospel. The social gospel is the opposite of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is that survival of the fittest. If you've done really, really well, then it's because you're the best. Social gospel, let's help the less fortunate. That's where the idea of the Salvation Army comes from. One of these ideas that comes out of the social gospel is to maybe let's fix these tenement homes. In order to fix the tenement homes, let's make settlement homes. And a settlement home is very similar to the tenement houses, and this is led by Jane Addams, who runs a specific settlement house, affordable apartment city living, and hers was called the Hull House. Hull House, one of the most famous settlement houses, run by Jane Addams. So, lots of changes during this time period. We know that the Gilded Age was known as the Gilded Age because of all this money, and part of the vast amounts of money coming into the United States or being available are because of all sorts of corruptions. We've looked at business, we've looked at government, so the first thing we'll talk about is government, and some of the ways that people can make money in the government are through graft. Graft is using your political power for personal gain, pushing things around, making sure that you're the one who comes out wealthy. One of those examples would be kickbacks. As we talked about whenever we mentioned the credit mobilier as being an example, where people can make a contract, charge more than it's worth to those who are signing it, and get some of that money back. An extreme example of fraud, or of course, lies, misrepresenting something in order to get as much financial gain as possible. Because all of this goes into the fact that this is the age of political machines. And a political machine is when one party comes to dominate an area. The example that we looked at in class was the Tweed ring, run by Boss Tweed. And Boss Tweed, 1860s, early 1870s, New York City, ran the Tammany Hall ring, and there was all sorts of graft and patronage. Goes along with the idea that if you get elected, you should be able to let the people that you want into office to work with you. So you give all sorts of jobs to those people who've helped you get elected. So why does the government allow this? Well, Boss controls all sorts of jobs, and he's going to give these jobs to those supporters, and also gives all sorts of great city services like orphanages and soup kitchens and things like that in order to remain elected. So the political machines are helping their people at the bottom, but they're getting rich off of it. And Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, great vast amounts of this. He's exposed by Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, who you looked at his cartoons. So remember Thomas Nast. Credit mobilier we have talked about. Lobbyists are going to hold a great amount of control during this Gilded Age, and civil service reform is going to be brought in because these political corruptions, patronage system has lasted for so long, ever since Andrew Jackson in government. So it's been going on for decades. Rutherford Hayes campaigns on the idea of trying to change this. It's going to take a while before they're actually able to move to a merit system. And the reason that this changes is because James Garfield, President Garfield, was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, who had felt that he had deserved a job in government. He doesn't. Chester A. Arthur comes in after Garfield is assassinated, and finally the Pendleton Act is going to be passed through. Now, during this time period, several other presidents, Cleveland twice, separated by Harrison. Tariffs are going to be the major issue. We're not really going to talk much about these presidents because from Reconstruction up through the 1896 election, it's kind of looked at as the era of do-nothing presidents where not much is going on. But there is a big change leading into that 1896 election, and that is, well, the United States is changing. Everything about it. There's a huge rise in industry, as we said. Farming had been on the decline, and the frontier has been totally closed off. The frontier closed off because of, well, we've already taken everything in the United States, but the idea that at one point the United States was great because of the frontier, and now that it's gone, we need to, find something to do, is the idea of the frontier thesis. And frontier thesis was written by Frederick Jackson Turner, and this is going to be kind of a big deal as we move into out of the Gilded Age and into the Progressive Era, because the Progressive Era, at the same time as being very progressive, is the period where we start to become an imperial power. But before we even get onto that, we just know that as it's gone out and our sphere of influence has decreased, there's a lot of problems for farmers, great debts, railroad charges, weather problems, prices are falling, and the farmers need a way to fix this. The way that they propose fixing the fact that they're greatly in debt and prices are like dropping lower and lower for them is that they want inflation. And this major inflation is going to be the idea that maybe we should do something like put two metals or bimetallism into our system of currency. Large farms use the railroads, they received rebates, they paid less for the long haul. Small farmers were unable to get this, so we end up with a political party emerging that's going to want inflation and regulations to the railroad, and they're called the Grange. The Grange, before they became the Grange, they were more of a social group, and they were called the Patrons of Husbandry. They begin evolving, they become the Grange, and they push for regulation of the railroad. The idea that they push for regulations are called Granger laws, and these Granger laws get passed through. They're going to move to the Supreme Court. Wabash versus Illinois is actually going to look at it and say that they cannot do this. But after Wabash versus Illinois, and the fact these Granger laws are deemed unconstitutional, we do end up with the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, which made the Interstate Commerce Act the first time that the federal government starts to really regulate commerce interstate-wide and put restrictions in place. So they're going to push for currency reform. In addition to that, the Grange, who are going to become the Populist Party, so we'll put right next to that populism, they're going to make their political platform, and we'll just write it up here, and that is called the Omaha Platform. And the Omaha Platform, and remember that because Omaha is in Nebraska and lots of farmers will be there. It's the center where they make it. They make it in 1892, so before the 1896 election, a whole election cycle earlier, and they want to increase the money supply. They want to do that through bimetallism, or as we move into William Jennings Bryan, is going to be the free silver movement. So they want to increase the money supply, allow for inflation, be able to pay off their debts more easily. They want an income tax. They want that income tax to be a graduated income tax or progressive income tax. That means the more money that you make, the more you're taxed. So if you make more money, not only is it a greater amount, because of course the percentage would be, but you're going to pay a higher percentage. So they want bimetallism. They want a graduated income tax. They want secret ballots within their government. They want an 8-hour workday because we know that is not the norm. And they want to control immigrants because the idea that immigrants were taking their jobs. They are the working class, and that is a big fear. So in 1893, year after this platform is pushed through, the nation enters a recession. So that's going to be a huge deal, and more people are taking notice of it, and they want to be able to pay off their debts. So bimetallism becomes more popular. Silver and gold, free silver, bimetallism. So how do we create a larger supply of money? Back our money by both. Call it greenbacks, which are going to be like paper money that's backed by both gold and silver bullion. And the gold standard is viewed as only a limit to how much money there actually is, so they want to increase it. And this is what leads us into the 1896 election. So in 1896, you have two politicians who are running. William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan had been a populist, and they had been absorbed into the Democratic Party. And you have William McKinley, who is going to keep backing the gold standard, and he is a Republican. William McKinley had been supported by many of those captains of industry that we talked about, are Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. All were in support of them, and they were all in support of the gold standard. William Jennings Bryan does make a very famous speech that hopefully you guys read and turned in your thing, called the Cross of Gold speech, where he warned of the issues that may arise as we crucify ourselves on a cross of gold in our government. So we want to switch to that. But William McKinley is going to win despite the popularity of the Cross of Gold speech. William Jennings Bryan does remain in government for the next several decades. Populism as a movement is going to die, and we're going to move into the era of the progressive era. But before we do that, quick refresh on our business and our labor. We looked at that in class. You guys did a couple of projects. Hopefully you'll remember all of it. and it won't be an issue as we move into this test. I know I'm speaking really, really fast, guys, but I'm trying to make sure that we have everything covered as best we can. So, 1880s, the U.S. becomes an industrial world leader with selling things. So the 1880s are a huge change. In 1880s, why? We have that unlimited labor force we talked about with people moving in to Ellis Island and Angel Island. We have an abundant coal supply, so we've got all sorts of energy. We have iron mining, and iron mining is going to give way to the steel industry. The discovery of oil by Edwin Drake. So oil, we got all sorts of fuel, and the fact that the railroad has been built up. Now, business is able to get massive during this time because of very laissez-faire type policies. And laissez-faire, of course, means the government keeps its hands off. So an unlimited immigration supply, very high tariffs, because high tariffs are going to protect American business. And a tariff, once again, that I know you guys know this from American History 1, but a tariff is a tax on imported goods, making it to where people will want to buy American local goods, even though they're more expensive. Public financing of railroads, we got all sorts of different changes technologically, telephone, light bulb, electric power, so you know the whole stuff with Edison and Nikola Tesla. The Bessemer process is really important because the Bessemer process allows us to change pig iron into steel. Phonograph, photography, all sorts of great things that are going to help America. Now let's talk about some of these entrepreneurs. We already have talked about multiple times John D. Rockefeller. So John D. Rockefeller is the owner of Standard Oil. And he did Standard Oil and managed to make it into a monopoly by using horizontal integration. And horizontal integration is where you buy up everything of a competition, competitor, like one of the businesses that's competing against you. We have Andrew Carnegie, who we looked at. Andrew Carnegie, of course, steel, and he wrote The Gospel of Wealth, where he proposed that the wealthy need to give away their money in order to help mankind. We have J.P. Morgan, who was a financier. He pulled the U.S. out of debt twice, paid off our debt, basically pulled us out of a panic that we've been having. Cornelius Vanderbilt is a shipping magnate. He'd done all sorts of things. The railroad, before that he used steamships. So really just this growth in American industry. And we've looked at it and we've thought, okay, maybe some things weren't good. We got horizontal integration through Rockefeller. Morgan and Vanderbilt both had some vertical integration. And vertical integration is that buying up of everything related to your industry to be able to control the prices and make the most money possible. In addition to that, we've also got groups like, less big than these, but still very important, the DuPont family. And the DuPont family made gunpowder, which was, of course, very important during this time period, moved their way into being like a chemical company that's still around today, just as these companies are still around today as well. James B. Duke is our North Carolina robber baron or captain of industry. Now no, captain of industry and robber baron are the same exact thing, just a different matter of perception. Captain of industry, they've done all the right things and that's why they're so great. Innovation, that's why they're rich. Robber baron, they used ruthless tactics, but they are the same people. George Westinghouse will be another one, and he's going to run electricity in the United States. So, Transcontinental Railroad was built in 1869, standardization of times. So our time zones come from that, and that's pretty important. We've already talked about railroad abuses and the Interstate Commerce Act. We've also got a growth of company towns. And a company town would be something like Pullman, which we talked about in class, where railroad cars are made, and the company owns every aspect of that. They pay the rent to the company pays them, and it can lead to all sorts of abuses. Big business, there's huge corporations that develop, and a corporation is when one business is owned by many, many different businesses within. So there is an advantage to a huge corporation, and that's the fact that there's greater efficiency and economy of scale, meaning the bigger it is, the less things cost to make, and that they can really make out a lot better there. A manager system, which goes along with the idea of productivity studies done by Winslow Taylor to prove that management is important to running a business properly. Some of the disadvantages of a huge corporation is that there's unfair competition practices, as we talked about with vertical and horizontal integration, corruption and bribery, and they're going to totally destroy the labor union. Public reactions to this kind of stuff, which had been pushed through and believed in because of social Darwinism, is that something we like our cheap goods, but it doesn't always work out well. A trust, something else we should know. Monopoly, of course, is one business controlling everything. A trust is multiple businesses acting as one. Robber barons, we've talked about philanthropy, giving away things for the good of mankind. And with all this stuff, the government does start to finally take notice and try to change things, and they do that with the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Sherman Antitrust Act is just a slap on the wrist to businessmen who start to create trusts or monopolies, and it's done in 1890. It's like $1,000 fine, maybe a year in jail. Not very much to these very wealthy businessmen, but it does set a precedent that things are going to change. So urban labor, we've already talked about the fact that there's urbanization. 400% increase over the several decades leading up to 1890. It's mostly unskilled labor, assembly line work. There's going to be sweatshops, incredibly low wages, long hours, child labor, all these things we talked about. And that's why you wind up with the birth of labor unions, the last thing you did when you made your poster. Strikes, collective bargaining. All right, class, so I apologize. My phone ran out of memory the last part of this video, so we're starting over somewhere near where I thought we left off. I know there might be some overlap, even if I'm doing the editing, but I just want to make sure I'd rather overlap than not have all the information in there. So let's get back to labor unions. A labor union, of course, we know is a group of workers that are all working together to try to meet the goals they have, such as shorter hours, better working conditions, higher pay, better benefits, whatever. They were incredibly strong during the mid-20th century. Don't really have them in the South. But when we're looking at the Gilded Age, they're the force that starts to really change things as we move into the Progressive Era. Some of the means they used to try to get their way were by using strikes. And a strike is where people opt not to work. Collective bargaining, which is where one person will represent the entire group because all of them using their collective force will be able to make things get done. And arbitration, and that word, of course, because it's maybe not one you know how to spell right off. Arbitration is where a third party is brought in order to settle a dispute. So the owners of the businesses, because this is the era of big business, would try to counter these means by creating blacklists, and a blacklist is a list of people who have been known to be involved in unions so that they will not be hired by other people. A lockout, because if you lock your workers out, they can't work. The business may lose some money, but they're going to wait them out, and eventually the workers are going to need to get back to work to make money, and they won't continue trying to use methods such as striking or collective bargaining to get their goals met. Scabs, bringing in someone to replace the worker, at least temporarily, or an injunction. And an injunction is when a court order is made. So court orders to stop a strike, to break that strike. So several examples of what happened with these unhappy workers and going on strike would be things such as the railroad strike of 1877. And the railroad strike of 1877 led from violent protests, and they ended up spreading throughout the United States because it was dealing with the railroad, which goes from state to state, and there were many different employees. And because Many of the National Guard people started to support those people who were striking, that federal troops were brought in to break the strike, and that often happens in any type of situation where it's a national issue. These labor unions, there's several famous groups such as the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor are like the first major labor union. And they used unskilled labor, meaning any worker could be a part of it other than, well, women, because women were not viewed as being the workers by the Knights of Labor. They were led by Terence Powderly, and this is the first means of trying to get an organization to nationwide to work for workers' rights. Eventually it failed because there were some weaknesses. If you have unskilled labor, any of these people are easily replaced. Another reason why they're going to fail is because of another example of a major strike or protest, and that's Haymarket riots. And Haymarket riots were revolved around the McCormick Reaper factory. They had many workers, both English-speaking and many German-speaking immigrants. They wanted to have an 8-hour workday, so they protested. When the protest happened, things turned violent. The police shot several protesters. So they started handing out pamphlets to create another type of protest 2 days later. And 2 days later, many people gather at Haymarket Square, and from there a bomb is thrown by an unknown person. Several people who were deemed anarchists or part of the labor movement were arrested, executed, died. But the Knights of Labor ended up getting the blame for this, and kind of one of those things that starts to kill the Knights of Labor. To replace the Knights of Labor is the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. And this is led by Samuel Gompers. And Samuel Gompers is a man who had fought for the labor movement and thought that the best way to make this happen would be through using skilled labor only, because a strike could be an actual legitimate weapon if skilled laborers are involved in it, because they're not as easily replaced by scabs. Multiple industrial unions. Eugene V. Debs will be another one. Eugene Debs is going to lead the strike at Pullman, the United Railway Union, and he is going to end up being arrested for this because the government steps in, once again, railroad-based, puts him in prison. He goes to prison and comes out even more radical than he had before. He becomes a socialist, and he's actually going to run for president several times. Women were involved in the labor movement as well by advocating for miners, different industrial workers, pushing for strikes and all sorts of things like that. Used women and children in the process. One of the most famous of these is Mother Jones, or Mary Harris Jones. And she is going to lead a children's march to Washington and ends child labor. So several other examples. This starts to put pressure on the government. Public support is in favor of the workers, and some of these situations end up being incredibly dangerous, such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is the example of when there was a huge tragedy in New York. Women who were stitching these blouses had been blocked off from the fire escapes, and huge fire happens, and almost all of the women die. So the government starts to put regulations on not just child labor, but also the working conditions and making sure that fire escapes cannot be locked. The homestead strike is one where the citizens of the United States see a huge violent strike between workers and owners, and Pinkertons are brought in and turns incredibly violent. It makes the labor movement more sympathetic. Same thing happens in Ludlow strike, which happens later on in 1914, where this is led by Rockefeller, and the National Guard is called in, and many people die. But this is the time period that leads us into the Progressive Era. Had it not been for all of these issues that happen, we probably wouldn't have the same awareness that comes during the Progressive Era, and that's what we're going to see as we move into our next section. So thank you for listening. Sorry that I had to redo the last part of the video, but hopefully this wasn't too terribly long, and hopefully it helps you in your test. Good luck. You're all going to do awesome. Thanks.